In a quaint little village, there lived a man named Peter. Peter was known for his meticulously maintained garden, which was the envy of the entire village. His flowers bloomed in vibrant colors, and his vegetables were always the plumpest and juiciest. Peter took great pride in his garden and spent hours every day tending to it. Next door to Peter lived an elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson. Mrs. Thompson's garden, in contrast, was unkempt and overgrown with weeds. She no longer had the strength to care for it, and her once beautiful garden had fallen into disrepair. The village people would often gossip about her untidy yard, but Peter ignored it, believing it was not his concern. One evening, as Peter was finishing up his work in the garden, he noticed Mrs. Thompson struggling to carry a heavy watering can. Her frail hands trembled, and she looked like she might collapse at any moment. Peter hesitated for a moment, then hurried over to help her. "Let me help you with that," Peter said, taking the watering can from her. Mrs. Thompson smiled weakly. "Thank you, Peter. I used to love gardening, but it's become so hard for me now." Peter felt a pang of guilt. He had never offered to help her before, too focused on his own garden to notice her struggles. That night, he couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Thompson's weary face from his mind. The next morning, Peter made a decision. He knocked on Mrs. Thompson's door and offered to help her with her garden. She was taken aback by his kindness, but gratefully accepted. Together, they began to clear the weeds, plant new seeds, and water the thirsty soil. As the days passed, Mrs. Thompson's garden slowly transformed. Flowers began to bloom again, and vegetables sprouted from the earth. As they worked side by side, Peter learned about Mrs. Thompson's life and the joys and sorrows she had experienced. They shared laughter and stories, and a deep friendship blossomed between them. The village people noticed the change and began to admire Peter not just for his beautiful garden, but for his generosity and kindness. One evening, as they sat on Mrs. Thompson's porch, watching the sunset over their now thriving gardens, she turned to Peter and said, "Thank you for everything, Peter. You've brought life back to my garden and to my heart." Peter smiled and replied, "I should be thanking you, Mrs. Thompson. You've taught me that a garden is not just about the flowers and vegetables, but about the love and care we give to each other." Peter remembered the teaching of Jesus Christ, who said, "Love your neighbor as yourself." Matthew 22 verse 39. He realized that true fulfillment came not from having the best garden, but from loving and serving those around him. From that day on, Peter made it a point to help his neighbors whenever they needed it, and the village became a warmer, more caring place. The moral of the story is that loving your neighbor, as Jesus taught, brings beauty and joy not just to their life, but to your own as well.